So this is Attenborough. And basically there is this, the photo I sent is an orchid. It's called the orchid, the hammer orchid. And basically there is this wasp. Let's see. There is this wasp that we are seeing now emerge from the ground, which is a species of wasp that, this is a female, it doesn't have wings, and it feeds on the larvae of beetles. And whenever it's mature, it goes out of the floor, out of the soil, and it climbs up to a piece of grass or a flower or something like that, and starts emitting pheromones. And the male individuals of the species send the pheromones and go towards her. And then they are like really big, and they do have wings, and they just pick her up and fly with her, and they mate in the air. And then once the female is burying the eggs, she lays them on beetle larvae. And this is an orchid which has there is a genera, there is like 10 species or so of these orchids. And they all have I think most of them have one single pollinator, which is this wasp. And basically it has evolved this weird appendix, which looks like the wasp. It releases pheromones that attract the male wasp. And once the male wasp is around, it has this quirky mechanical hinge that basically makes it so that when the male starts trying to grab the female and fly away, it hits the part of the flower where the pollinia are found, which are, so the video only reaches this part. Okay, so that's the crazy mechanism. I think there is at some point here, but it's really beautiful. It's like super starry and super light. You see the males go really crazy with it. Like they really try hard until they get the pollinia. But I also wanted to go a bit further than the video because, well, I think in the end of the video you can see how the pollinia get attached to it. There's also like a kind of a fight between males for the female, so it seems to be very effective. You can see in the end, the guy's really desperate, and there he gets the yellow thing it has in his back is the pollinia. So not only that, but because the orchids have these very specific pollinators, they have evolved a mechanism which is, instead of using pollen, like normal pollen, they use these pollinia, which are like sticky sacs of pollen. And they only have 2 usually. So this is an event that happens one time, and the wasp gets the 2 pollinia, and that's it. Like that's all the chances the orchid has to survive. So to make sure that it works, then the wasp has to go to another orchid and do the same thing and attach the pollinia to the other orchid with the female flowers. The seeds are like, they can have up to thousands of seeds. They are microscopic. I used to study those seeds, and they are completely empty. They have no nutrients. They have only the embryo in the center and a structure around it that protects it a little bit, but it has no nutrients, nothing that the embryo can feed on. And to be able to germinate, it needs a cell from a fungus to enter the seed. There is a hole in the seed that the fungus can enter in, and the fungus has to start feeding the embryo so that it can grow. And usually those fungus are also extremely specific, so much so that it's really difficult to grow some orchids because we don't know which fungus are helping them, and we don't have the ability to grow them. That's it.
I'm sorry, but this is just like, you see this video, and when you think of philosophy, you immediately think of Deleuze and this reason ontology in which you have animals or living beings from different species evolving together but still remaining separately. So being both autonomous but also interconnected, which for me is a really good way of having relationality without falling into a relativism that dissolves all notion of order. And yeah, it's impressive. I really enjoyed it.
Cool. I'm glad to hear that.
It's nice in comparison to sort of human-based arguments on evolution and how instrumental traits are, and things like, are people a blank slate or not? These kind of ongoing arguments that are in the more public-facing aspects of philosophy and social science and stuff. Like seeing this is sort of very calming in that it's sort of clear there's a structure and an order. It's a little bit hard to imagine exactly its trajectory, even with a good understanding of natural selection, but it's sort of, it seems pleasingly separate from human concerns in a way that's understandable.
Please
But
think
also,
what, sorry?
it's sort of pleasingly separate from human concerns in a way that makes it more understandable. I do wonder if, like, is it ethical somehow? Like, is what the orchid has done, is that okay? What it's done to those wasps? I'm not sure if it's useful to try and think of one's ethics or ethics in general in a way that can reach out to that part of biology. But I do have a bit of concern for the poor wasps are being a little bit exploited here in this
But
process.
maybe it depends on how we understand ethics now.
Exactly.
Because,
I think
like,
it's useful.
yeah, we usually have an ethics that is bound to this idea of humans being really special beings, being goals in themselves that can govern themselves and can rule over the, I don't know, the inert matter. But so in that case, it would be no question of ethics there. And if you project that structure onto other beings than humans, then I think it would also become a bit absurd in the sense that you could say that the orchid is exploiting or instrumentalizing the wasp. But I mean, does any harm ensue from that?
I think
Or
one of the things I wanted to, I mean, I thought it would be interesting to touch on was like reading Harman's object-oriented ontology. One of the things that made me more uncomfortable was his treatment of symbiosis. I felt like he doesn't really understand the concept of symbiosis somehow. Like I think he sometimes mixes the concept of endosymbiosis with symbiosis with commensalism or parasitism or other relations. So it's like somehow I feel like he lives like he takes symbiosis as meaning like some form of interaction between organisms, and it's a bit more specific. So in this case, for example, I would call this commensalism, in that the wasp is not really suffering that much. Like usually it could be a symbiosis, like many plants offer some sugars to the insects that are pollinizing them, and orchids are famous for being a bit more tricksters. They just synthesize pheromones or whatever, so the insect doesn't get anything in exchange, but it also doesn't suffer from the process, I think. I mean, it just loses maybe 10 seconds.
well, it's also I want to get back to this symbiosis stuff because I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about it. But before we go on to that, maybe address again this ethics question, because it's also, so what I was also trying to say is that somehow ethics in its like most mainstream general acceptance is an individualistic ethics, relying on one-to-one interactions or um, agents acting somehow independently of their environment or of their extended reference of networks of reference. But in this case, if we were to think of an ethics in the animal species or extended to all things or relations and so on and so forth, you can't apply the same categories because you don't have to just think about the benefits that the wasp gets and the orchid gets. You have to think in the extended field of relations there. And the wasp may not get anything directly commercially in exchange. It also doesn't get harmed, but that doesn't mean that their interaction is not suitable for like the stability of their ecosystem, which benefits both eventually. So it would be ethical, it's just maybe a bit funny to us.
Yeah, I think ethics and ecology should be more often mixed.
I think they are becoming. And I've been recently working on Latin American philosophy and their import of indigenous concepts that make use of this interconnectedness of man, of human beings with nature and ecosystem, in which nature is not just an environment or is not just the space in which humans go about with their lives. It's an actual entity recognized as having its own rights, which have to be respected, which have to be treated as equally as human rights are to be treated. So I think we do see a shift in this direction, and it's really cool to see how it evolves. But it's not yet mainstream. It hasn't yet penetrated all narratives, and it still has a long way to go, but I think it can help us move forward in our understanding of ethics, especially in a relational ethics.
Actually, what I feel it's just because you were Razvan, you were talking about indigenous knowledge and indigenous conception of nature, and I've been reading a lot about it, and I'm really interested in that. And actually, what I feel is really interesting, and in some way, it connects a bit to an object-oriented vision of reality, is that what many, for example, indigenous people from Amazonia actually think is that there is no separation between the human realm and the natural realm. So you have this, like, there are a lot of things, but you have this famous discourse by Ailton Krenak, which says, like, what could even be not nature, like what is not nature. Like, it doesn't even make sense to separate something from nature that is not nature because it's human. So I think that this non-anthropocentric position it's interesting. It can be connected in an interesting way with what we are discussing it here. And the example Jaime gave us, it's amazing because it shows now how, like, one single flower now needs two other like organisms from very different and far away species, and to just like spread these seeds, no? And actually, like, it's not so different for us, no? Like, the more we discover about our gut, no, the more we discover that actually, like, we survive because of very similar symbiotic connections, no? Like, the bacteria and fungi that lives in our gut, like, literally produce like most of the hormones and neurotransmitters that we use. Like, so okay, so I'm connecting everything now, but this makes me think again about an extended mind kind of approach, like, in that actually even the chemicals that are seems to be at the basis, of our reasoning and of our mind are related to other beings that are symbiotically connected with us.
Yeah, I think that's an important note that, like what you were talking about, the Amazonian thinking. So indigenous concepts don't take nature as something separate from human life, and there is no concept of nature like the European one that insists on the distinction between an human endowed with soul or with faculties different than any other thing that we find in nature, but is this symbiotic or community based relation there in which there is no precedence, there is no strict distinction. And I just started reading, Fedi recommended me Eduardo Con's book, how
Oh,
forests
foresting.
exactly, yeah.
Very nice book.
Yeah, and especially the introduction is really nice. This lack of borders between human, between the animal, between nature, and also between like life and death and all of these different domains that we normally separate quite clearly in our conceptual thinking. And I think this is an important new development, especially if you think that this is being done in anthropology. So something that by its name is anthropocentric, and the fact that non-human relations enter discourses and actually teach humans about what it is to be human. So new dimensions about ourselves. This speaks very highly of any attempt of relationality that wants to extend the horizon of our thinking and also the horizon of things that are beyond our reach. Because I was thinking now about this example, the wasp and the orchid. It's really interesting that this symbiosis, if it is a symbiosis, let's get back to that later. This has evolved throughout a very long period of time, I assume. And this relates to also to kind of arguments of the Meyasu type, in which there is a process in the world that we now or just now observe and understand, but that has been going on without our uh, cognition, without our presence. And it is a testament of not just that things exist and things go on with their lives, but also that they can develop relations on their own accord and with their own interests without us contributing one bit. But maybe we can go back to this symbiosis question. I'm curious to see like what your issues were with Harman, because he doesn't talk too much about symbiosis. And I'm also interested in this distinction between symbiosis and endosymbiosis.
Yeah, not. I don't have this stuff super fresh in my mind, but from what I remember, symbiosis um, is a relation between two organisms in which both benefit. So, for instance, the hippopotamus that has the birds that cleaned him, and the birds get the food, and he gets the cleanliness. Then endosymbiosis is, um, I think it was born with, I don't know if Margulis was the first one to talk about it, but it was referring to the relation between like the origins of the eukaryotic cell as being a combination from two different cells. According to her, I think she, I don't know what's the state of this, like what people think now, but I think it was supposed to be an archaeobacteria and a bacteria in the case of animal cells. And the difference with symbiosis, I would say, is that, well, it's tricky. I don't know if, like, according to, I mean, they form a single organism, while in symbiosis, its organism keeps its own autonomy. In endosymbiosis, the bacteria that is now our mitochondria, it lost during like in an evolutionary scale probably, but it lost slowly many of the genes that were necessary for living autonomously, which is something that many pathogens do also. So like viruses, I think, could be seen as an extreme case of that, although they are not considered alive officially, but they also have like nothing to survive on their own. They have to be, which is why they are not considered alive, because they are completely unable to do any metabolic processes if they are not inserted in a cell. So I would say that's the main difference between symbiosis and endosymbiosis. I don't remember, like, I can take the book if you want. I don't remember exactly the passages, but I felt in general that he was using the term symbiosis very lightly, like to refer to just like interactions between objects. and I felt that he was kind of ignoring he's taking a biological word and he's using it in a way that kind of could be a bit richer if he had also used commensalism and parasitism and endosymbiosis with a bit more care, because I think like you can also have relations as this one, which I wouldn't call a symbiosis, because at least like maybe ecologically you can say that, yeah, the wasp is gaining an advantage because the orchid is gaining an advantage, but in the interaction itself, it doesn't seem to gain anything, but the orchid is gaining something.
As far as I remember, he uses symbiosis mostly for like internal relations of an object, no? Like what keeps an object stable throughout history.
Like he uses a bit metaphorically for relations between people inside the social theory kind of frame. That's what I remember from immaterialism.
Okay.
I mean, he considers it more in line with the sensuous objects rather than his normal objects when he thinks of symbiosis. Because like the East India Company, I thought, if I remember it correctly, was like bound largely by more sensual objects because of its distributed nature, right? Like its offices in India and its ships and its people and its artifacts were all sort of bound together by sensual objects rather than by their physical nature most of the time. I think it's sort of a limitation somewhat of the ontology he suggests. Is it still not like it's what the lines between objects are? It's hard to see how you build a company in a way that is sort of describable from his use of objects. What its joints would be, like how you would dissect and describe its components, and do so differently with the basis of his ontology is sort of hard to understand. In the same way with this example of the wasp, it's not clear exactly how his system would describe that in a way that brings novelty. It's not super clear.
Well, I guess this is where he attempts to use symbiosis, but the paradox still remains the fact that if you have objects that are formed through the interaction of other objects, that object would be a lesser object than the initial objects for Harman, which kind of violates his own thesis that no object is a lesser object. Yeah, this is a big point for relationality, the fact that so Harman tries to decentralize this human perspective, but in doing so he gets a good start, I think. I like the way he starts, I like the way he goes up to this object oriented ontology, but then he introduces this distinction between sensual and real qualities and all of the tensions there inside the object. That is a way to an unavoidable dualism, to an unavoidable dichotomy that raises a lot of issues. And as we say in TTT, if all qualities are relations and if all things are in relation and in situations, then you're always in an in-between state. You're never like fully fixed, fully determined, and you're never caught up between these various tensions or various dichotomies. It's just like a free-flowing fabric that just has autonomous things, but that can still interact with each other on the same level as the parts that make them up. So there is no distinction introduced there on an ontological level. Last time, Jaime, you were having or you were raising issues with understanding how relationality doesn't fall into a
I do like the biology as a way of thinking about TTT. That's for sure.
I think it's really compatible, and it's an intuitive way of at least giving examples of how we can think of things relationally that can enter specific situations.
Yeah, there is one point that I tried to make in one of the first sessions of TTT that maybe now I see a better connection, but I still don't know maybe how to phrase it ideally. But like to me, it feels like somehow having a flat ontology makes total sense, especially being non-anthropocentric. But I also think that completely ignoring the difference between live things and other things is a bit, I don't know, it feels weird to me.
Like the distinction is is not on the ontological level, and that living things share a relation that other things do not, which is life. And but in the same way, non-inanimate objects also possess relations that humans or animals do not. So in that sense, I would say it's not so much an ontological distinction that has to be made between the two, but it's more about like a big situational horizon in which you can distinguish how things inhabit situations. Like, for example, the existence of a rock is a lot longer than temporally than the existence of a human, but the way that existence plays out is different. So the relation in which the rock exhibits its existence is a inanimate one, and the way in which a human or an animal or a plant exhibits its relation with existence is an animate one. Would that satisfy your concern?
Yeah.
But what did you want to add concerning to
So
this?
yeah, so I was thinking, so there is the second law of thermodynamics that says that in a closed physical system, which is an ideal system that doesn't really exist, but in an isolated system, the entropy never decreases with time. So entropy either stays the same or increases. Entropy in this sense is thought of as something with, for example, so I'm with thinking about atoms and molecules. If you have, let's say you have an isolated system that's like a perfectly isolated box, and you have a bunch of atoms inside. If all the atoms are separated, like they are each on their own, the entropy of the system is high because the amount of possible conformations that those atoms could form is high. So they could mix in many different ways, right? If all those atoms are structured in a single structure in a big molecule that's very stable, then the entropy of the system is lower because there is only not so many conformations that the system can have afterwards. It's more like it needs energy or something to change conformation. So the second law of thermodynamics says that systems tend to the first case. So if you have a big molecule in an isolated system, with time it is not infinitely stable. It will separate and the atoms will diffuse and the system will become more entropic. And I studied this in biology, and then I was trying to explain this to a friend of mine, and he was like, yeah, but it's not true. Like the system, like the universe doesn't tend to entropy. If you think of us, we are super structured. We are the opposite of that. We are not just molecules floating around. So first, like I see this definition of entropy, the statistical mechanics definition of entropy as being very relational, because it's about how many relations are formed and how many relations could be formed in the next step. And also I think it's, I don't know, in my head it's a bit mixed, like the concept of ontological and universal. So for me, because it's the second law of thermodynamics, it sounds ontological, but maybe it's not. But I think that's a huge distinction, right? Like organisms, if you think about it, life on Earth as we know it is a struggle to fight, there is not a conscious fight, but it's a continuous line of parts of the universe that have managed to decrease their entropy. And all of life orbits around orbits around like we need to eat to break down molecules and to increase the entropy on our surroundings so that we can keep our internal order. So I think I would add that.
I guess almost in the TTT framework, that if there was maximum entropy, there'd be no things, right? There would just be situations and no things.
Well,
really.
You still could talk about like spatial location as being a relation, I guess.
It's true. There would just be relations.
Yes,
right?
yes.
You could have a bit of space and you could call it a thing, but that thing wouldn't be different than every other thing because all all the component parts could be evenly distributed across everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so I feel like tonight Jaime is addressing all the points that I want to address. But I do have like a slight difference in understanding of entropy than you, namely that. So you were saying that life on Earth is kind of a struggle, or a struggle to escape entropy. Like the more life you have, the less entropy. Or, but I think it's actually the reverse. It's actually having entropy is an essential quality, an essential condition for stability. So precisely having the possibility of a system to rearrange itself is due to this inertia of entropy that tends to remain um, throughout the life of a system, for example. Without
I
that,
think
yeah, sorry.
no, sorry to interrupt you, but I think I think the way I see it is not about having no entropy. It's about the direction of change. It's about things. If you leave a human body in a room for 5,000 years, it will decompose and turn into dust. And life, like that's the normal direction of the universe. And life is kind of going in the opposite direction. Of course, it's not zero entropy. It's just decreasing or maintaining a low entropy level. But yeah, sorry.
This is like what Francisco Varela would call autopoiesis. This sort of constant struggle to maintain one's like biological requirements in the face of basically the second law of thermodynamics and other things that might destroy it. I think that's the name he gives the struggle you describe. I just went one like Razan.
Yeah.
If there was zero entropy, would there only be? I guess there would sort of only be things.
So this is
Like,
where I think Jaime's example is a good one. If you just close a human being in a room, it will decompose and then nothing happens. But if you increase entropy a bit, then there's the possibility of more interactions, of more relation between things, between the elements of a system. And
those two things are the same. I mean, the human decomposing is increasing in entropy. And it is, as you say, an increasing potentiality. Like you have all the molecules separated, so you could make a plant out of the human, while having a human, you couldn't make a plant directly.
The no entropy example is sort of a human in stasis, in sort of a sci-fi situation where they just don't change.
The what, sorry?
So the no entropy situation would be like a human in stasis. Like they were doing some deep space voyage and they were cryogenically frozen or in some sort of stasis field or something, which we don't know how to make. But that would be sort of the zero entropy type situation.
But that would still be so this is the thing that would still be for the perspective of the human in the space shuttle. But I also think, so for example, entropy does increase in that room with the decaying person because of the molecules and so on and so forth. But if you don't introduce a new element, so if you don't increase the entropy from the start, if you just close it down to this room and this person, then the increasing entropy from that room would not be able to realize itself so it would not be able to perpetuate life. If you have it in a system in which there are elements that can interact with those decaying elements, then entropy kind of rearranges itself also towards the direction of life. So I don't see life as like an opposite direction of entropy. I see it more as a balance between a balance or a tension between increasing and decreasing entropy.
Like imagine the room was coated with a medium that was really good for one aspect of our biota, and you just left the person in that room. Essentially, the entropy would collapse down until that biota made contact with the medium, and then it would do very well because that was the lowest. That was the unit that could maintain autopoiesis in that environment, in that situation, most easily. So even though the person is gone, there's this other part of it that was endosymbiotic that would then be able to do fine on its own, because that environment is sufficient for it to continue. So that would allow that entropy to be controlled by that level of the thing, which was previously a person. So
But in this example, also the increase in entropy is essential for change, for something new to appear.
Yeah, exactly. And then the new thing is sort of well, I'm not sure in what order it goes, but it's the thing that can maintain itself in that environment first, right? As the higher structure breaks down, which is the person, then there's various different things that within that person that could maintain themselves in an environment. And if the environment is favorable to that thing, it's the thing that can be autopoietic there, right?
But it would still be determined by this condition of entropy, because it can evolve to a higher structure thing that can then decay and so on and so forth in a really long time span. And why I insist so much on this entropy stuff is because of a thing that we discussed last time, especially concerning like politics and ethics and so on and so forth. And I think having entropy as entropy I understand as this like relational infinity in TTT terms. And I think having entropy or relational infinity as something that is in balance with the situational directions of things. So in the entropy example,
I think maybe that I'm not super convinced by that definition of entropy. Sorry.
Which
maybe
one?
I just don't see it. But infinite relationality. No, you said that's the way you think of entropy.
Yeah.
But that sounds like something that's being realized. Like the more entropy you have, the more infinite relations you have. But it's kind of the opposite. It's not the opposite, but it's the more entropic the system is, the more possible relations could be formed. So it's about the potentiality of the system, not about the existing relations. It's about both, but the link I see between infinite relationality and entropy would be more on that sense, on like a potential sense.
Yeah, but I was about to get to that so when you have the relational infinity, you also have this increase in potentiality, in the sense that you have either ethical or political situations that are always somehow so there hangs this weight of relationality over them, or this weight of potentiality over them at each moment of their situational existence, which restricts precisely the possibility of narrowing them down to this absolute state of self-sufficiency. So translated into like the example of a dictatorship has as purpose narrowing down the power relations to one atomary structure in order to maintain power, to be self-sufficient in that power structure. But having entropy or relational infinity as also enabling infinite potentiality subtracts from that possibility of reducing that power relation to one person or one family for an infinite amount of time. And by actually paying attention to, like in your example, to how nature plays out, to how animals interact, how chemicals interact, or molecules, it is important to introduce this aspect of relational infinity and interconnectedness and entropy in that sense as increasing, as for me, as a necessary condition both for change and for stability. And stability understood not as narrowing down everything to one closed system, as stable as possible for one moment, but as in the example of the wasp and the orchid, as stable throughout the entire ecosystem. So stable throughout an extended system of reference, as extended as possible. So to include each agent, each actor, each thing within that thought of stability.
So I would slightly disagree with what you're saying while still agreeing. In that, so one way of securing power in the political sense you describe is to sort of limit entropy, right? To create like a solid structure within which it's hard to confront that particular centralized power, right? But we see now, particularly in Russia, for example, there's this new approach to maintaining power that the Putin regime seems to have taken. And that's this, I forget the name they use. It's created by a guy called Surkov, who used to be involved in contemporary dance. And he brought this idea of essentially, there's a sort of contrast between Orwell's future and Huxley's future, right? So Orwell's is this very structured, low entropy system, whereas in Brave New World, it's this system where people don't know what is true. And what seems to be in the thing in Russia is this guy Zarkov funded anti-Putin groups, various different civil rights groups, neo-Nazi groups, all these different movements, and then let people know that he was doing it. So all of a sudden, truth becomes meaningless, right? So against the totalitarian government, no action, it makes sense because you'll be crushed. And in this sort of Surkov and Russia, and also very much in the Trump regime, is that no action makes sense because nothing makes sense, right? There's, so like in one case you have the maximum entropy, and then there's all this possible relationality, but none of it does anything, none of it matters. And in the other case, there's just very little things that you can do, so you're stuck. And I think Jaime, you were sort of making this argument a little bit about entropy, I think, which is that at the two extremes, there's not much room for stuff to happen that matters. If you have complete entropy, there may be infinite relationality, but none of the relations really will have any impact, right? And in the zero entropy situation, in the totalitarian one, there's just no possibility of behaving differently. So there seems like,
yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that's exactly like the direction in which I wanted to go, and it's mostly to have stability, so to have situational awareness of meaningful relations, of ethical relations, of truth, and so on and so forth, but tensioned by the infinite relationality. So tensioned, kind of like, I always like to think of it like this surface tension of water that allows allows water either to maintain shape or to take the shape of something else, or to allows insects to float around on water and so on and so forth. But that is like a really fine tension between its surface and its depth. And that's the way I see like stability in this sense. Stability is nice, is okay, and there should be this possibility of meaningful relations and of situational truth and so on and so forth. But at the same time, this should be weighed down also by this relational infinity and entropy potentiality. This in order, precisely because otherwise you end up like in this Trump regime where there's nothing much to do, right? So, or in totalitarian regimes in which there's nothing much to do and everything seems to go on forever in the same state. And in order to have change, entropy has to weigh down that situation that seems stable to a point of no return. That's what I was trying to say, that um, each tension is in itself just a situation, and each situation is weighed or has its weight in its infinite relationality. So it draws from that infinite relationality, and that is the condition for the situation to dissipate in new situations, for example, or to revolve or to accumulate and transform into new situations. So the possibility of change is really important for me here. And I think the the thought of entropy is a nice idea to work with. Does this make sense to you guys, that like stability is tensioned by relationality? So in the sense that there is always, let's say, a foreign element or an unstable element that can enter a stable subset of things and then produce change, and that
Yeah,
that
but
is like always possible.
I feel like you're sort of skirting around dynamic systems theory ideas on stuff like the nature of criticality of something being poised with just enough relations or entropy so that certain types of perturbations can cause large change, but others don't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's also the thing about them being very sensitive to initial conditions, which doesn't seem necessarily relevant here. But there's this idea that like a network of relational properties is often functional because it's poised on the edge of being able to change in very distinct, rapid ways, but that those ways are somewhat constrained by other factors, right? So like neural function in some ways is like this. We have these feed-forward cascades that are caused by visual stimuli, which are a sudden massive change in the network. But somehow, the network is not fundamentally changed by them, but there's a massive change in its properties for a little while as that thing goes through it, as that process occurs.
I think I like that, but I would also want to have more fundamental change.
Like I think one of the things that's interesting about this in the ecosystem thing is that like there was this belief for a long time that ecosystems were very stable, and that like if you just take where that orchid was and just like burn, say, 6 square miles and then come back a few years later, it'll look sort of the same, right? So there's this idea that there was this deep stability in these ecosystems. But then it seems like when you look very closely at them, their constituent components are actually quite different, in that like you may not have that same species of orchid or wasp in that area, but you may have other orchids doing similar things or other plants. So like if you zoom out enough, the system is very stable. But if you look at its constituent parts, it's not. Like I guess maybe if there's some sort of hostile takeover at the East India Company, that superficially it might look very similar, but all the people in the offices have been reshuffled and there's a new organizational culture that you might not otherwise notice.
So it's important then to have precisely this capability of zooming in and zooming out, which was something that Zach was addressing last time too. So to be able to scale down the way you look at situations from the individual atom to, I don't know, the solar system and so on.
Like I think this would be a fun thing to explore in TTT framework, because we were talking earlier about indigenous peoples.
Mm-hmm.
And like now we're starting to see the earth in an increasingly Lovelockian manner, right? Like that I'm not sure if it's now more of a thing or more of a situation, but we're not so separate from it now in the way that indigenous peoples often weren't. They didn't have this separation, and we're sort of, in principle, losing that separation as we now understand the planet is this thing that we're on, that we're sort of endosymbiotically related to it. But for a long time, we didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So there's sort of a within ontology shift, or there would be considered an ontological shift between sort of indigenous people's view of this situation that they had compared to the classic sort of industrial Western view. But both of those things seem to fit within TTT. Like the different situations of those cultures emphasize different aspects of whether a thing was a thing, or it was a situation, or whether we were endosymbiotic, or whether we were sort of, there was lots of it, so we didn't have to consider our relationship to it because we could always take more. So how we relate to the structure we're within seems to be an interesting thing that TTT might be able to speak more on, expand a bit more.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting point, and I think I turn back to this book, How Forests Think, or no, that was the title. And so one trivial sentence in that book is that like in the Amazon, people live in the forests and interact highly with the forest and with the food they eat and so on and so forth, and they don't see it as something different from that. And I was thinking precisely at the European ontologies that separate man from nature, and how that separation has increased with like technological advancement, with the possibility of not interacting so much with nature, with the possibility of, I don't know, buying everything online or in a supermarket or whatever. But then how we regress a bit to this view of involvement and situatedness and being integrated in nature and part of nature as soon as we're forced to interact with nature again, as we're confronted with, well, with the existence of nature outside of our ontologies, with nature that is increasing in entropy precisely because we focused too much on one aspect, or on one aspect, on our interests, on our existence, and not on other agents or actors or things or whatever in our ecosystem.
It also seems like we had to know more of it. Like there's an informational relation that changed in Western societies. Like before we had industrialization and stuff, and like quite far back, I imagine we also had similar indigenous approach to nature as it not being separate from us. And then as large societies develop, they tend to move away from sort of nature-based or nature-embedded ideas of myth or God. And as large societies develop, they develop these ideas of sort of punishing, moralistic, monotheistic things.
I was just citing, like, there's a very famous article from the 60s, I think, from an historian called Lynn White. The article is called "The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis," and he started like he goes back to find where in European history we invented this concept of nature and this separation between like humanity and nature as and this vision of nature as something that humans have to dominate and to control. And he actually traced the roots exactly to a mixture between the Christian religion and the technological advancement in agriculture of the Middle Ages. Sorry, it was just like you were saying that, so I thought about it, but maybe it's not so much related.
No, I think it's very much related. Like now I think we think of the Earth more and more like a thing or like an organism because we sort of have meaningful metrics of its situation, right? In the same way, Christians think, like hardcore Christians in the US think that gay marriage will anger God. We're sort of concerned that too much carbon will anger the planet. Like we now have this idea of our myth having some sort of set of that is an agent, and now we then need to know more about the planet to also consider it an agent. We can sort of go back to just seeing everything as having agentic properties. We now need to sort of fill it with rules and interests on the global scale. So things like carbon and stuff like that start to give it value functions that we can respond to. And we can sort of fit it into the existing framework that we have. But it requires us to have data about it. For us to be able
Maybe not just data, also like what you were saying about, so it's not just that we're confronted with nature, it's also that our knowledge system increases and it goes into like the depths of both biology, physics, and geology, the interconnectedness of all of these ecosystems and how they affect our lives. And I think this draws like your remark reminds me of like the evolution of history too. Like Georgia was also saying, we have a direction of moving away from mythology to this like idealistic view that led to like the Illuminist phase, in which separation from nature is freedom essentially, and like the technological advancement and political advancement has been associated with this clear-cut distinction between us and nature, or between us as self-governed individuals and everything that is chaotic outside of us, because there is no self-governance there. And then you have a shift not only in data collection or scientific approaches to nature and so on and so forth, but also in worldviews, in the sense that we finally see that this idealistic approach is not sustainable. Is not sustainable neither conceptually nor like empirically, nor I don't know what life has to do with it. And this seems like a good point to touch on an important concept in TTT, which we see as one of like the main conceptual operators, which is flattening. And flattening is precisely this process in which the relational infinity of things gets situationally fixed or based. So in a situation, the infinite thing is a flattened version of itself, so a restricted version of itself. And flattening also applies to how we relate to world, to cognition, to perception, and so on and so forth. And if one advantage of having flattening in TTT is precisely what you were saying, Scott, that we can navigate various ontologies, various philosophies, various cognitive structures, and explain through flattening as this conjoining of the infinite relational concept and the situation concept, and we can explain how things flow from one situation to another based on these flattening processes. So, for example, if you look at this history of achieving self-governance, like the main flattening process there was to enable a narrative that is focused on providing and ensuring that the interests of individuals were secured, for example. And that flattening process extends just like a river, let's say. It has a lot of byproducts or by processes, but they work towards this goal of ensuring the individual interests of people. And sorry, and
I
then
guess.
yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, and then I was trying to say that this flattening process has started to focus not so much on the individual, but more on the community, and then extend it on ecosystems, and then even more extend on flat ontologies in which nothing is distinguishable. And I think this also has to do with this historicity of how we evolve and how our relation with our ecosystems, with nature, and so on and so forth, um, develops itself. And I think it's a flexible enough concept that can allow us to move from one point of view to another without excluding any of them. So reframing them instead of dismissing them.
This is like a consistent part of this Anthropocene philosophy. Is a bit starting from that point, like from a criticism of individualism, and actually, like in some way, the endosymbiotic theory of Lynn Margulis, is considered like the point of change between like the main scientific support to an anti-individualistic vision of life, no? And so just to get back to what to this example Jaime was bringing on, like I think that in this sense, like symbiosis should be considered more seriously inside our framework, like instead just as a metaphor, but exactly as a as one of the scientific tools that can sustain like de-flattening of the individual.
Yeah, I guess two other flattening agents that seem really powerful is sort of monotheism and currency, because they both have the, like, in a way they're sort of similar in that they're omnipresent and omnipotent. So anything can be reduced to value or necessarily, I guess, to God in that position. And also, or anything can be reduced to money, and money can be used to get anything, right? That's sort of its omnipotence and omnipresence. And that seems to be sort of an example of a almost optimized flattening of stuff. Like that set of relations, you now have a means of relating to everything, right? You have currency, or you have God.
Yeah.
So there's a will in everything and a knowledge over everything, and there's a way of paying for everything, a value on top of everything.
Yeah, that's an extreme version of flattening, but it's also important to specify here that flattening is unavoidable. Like you were saying last time, Scott, that we're always mining, we're always doing something there, and because all things are always situational, and all things are situations at the same time, flattening is unavoidable. But what can be done is first have an awareness of flattening, and that flattening is not an absolute tool of isolating something that is irreducible, but that everything reduces to. And second, you can also direct how you flatten. So instead of focusing on, let's say, superficial relations between things, you can also focus on the depth of relations. So uh, while you focus on the value of behavior of people as products that you can sell to companies to shape their ads and so on and so forth, you can also flatten them based on their personal relations, their intimate relations. You can expand the focus of flattening, but you can never get rid of flattening. So there is always a perspective there. It's also not arguing in a naive way that we can access things in their entirety without having any situations or any context to that.
I am a bit sad that we have dropped the entropy discussion. I have to say that. I will obsessively bring it back whenever I have the chance. But I also don't know how we missed, how I didn't mention the information theory entropy, because I think that's also, I everything you were saying, I'm like mapping it to entropy somehow, and I think the entropy in information theory, which is connected to the one in physical mechanics, it's also an interesting one here, and for flattening, and I think, in a way, I think there are interesting connections to make there.
I don't, like, from the TTT perspective, I don't see any difference really between sort of physical entropy and informational entropy. They seem identical. Maybe that's perhaps because we haven't drilled down into it enough, but that's potentially cool if those two things can be combined in a way that works. That's nice.
Yeah.
Can you maybe expand on information?
Yeah,
So
maybe.
the difference or the similarities, because I'm not familiar with these concepts.
So, Scott, do you wanna give it a go, or should I try?
I think you should try.
So Wikipedia says, in information theory, the entropy of a random variable is the average level of information, surprise, or uncertainty inherent in the variable's possible outcomes. So
like 50-50 is maximum entropy in a system.
Yeah.
The more evenly likely things are to be predicted, then that's the maximum entropy.
Yeah. Which makes sense if you think about the physical systems. Like if you have a pool, like a soup of atoms, then arguably all possible combinations have, or atoms or particles or whatever, if they are all the same and they are all equally spaced, and then any possible combination could happen. So that's maximum entropy. And when you have only one molecule, with all of those particles once are together, then only maybe one state or two can happen afterwards.
Like one of the arguments about what the brain does is it tries to limit surprise or informational entropy, right? Like that's its fundamental role. It's one theory of how to approach what the brain's doing in
Which
like
is
one phrase. It's flattening, I guess, but
that's what I was going to say. It's flattening. It's the same thing. No?
It is flattening. I was thinking of like YouTube and recommendations. So because if you wouldn't have recommendations, you would just have full entropy there, right? In the database of YouTube. But then, so it's useful to have recommendations, but then again, the recent algorithm at least flattens those recommendations to
outrage.
hmm?
To generating outrage.
Yeah. So it's actually producing like idiotic recommendations in the sense that you get somehow like in the example of Jaime, you feel like you get closed off in a room with just the interests that you once expressed, and the algorithm has flattened you to this version.
So there's a really interesting example of how this algorithm relates to entropy and surprise. So when it comes to predicting people's interests in movies or music or things like this, there's just a hard limit that we seem to reach. And then we can be pretty good at predicting that people will like something within their preference to like, 70 or 80%. But there's like 20% of stuff out there or 10% of stuff that is just complete surprise to any predictive system that people like, right? So there's sort of there's an inexploitable well of entropy there. But the algorithms are still being made to generate your preferences. So they have sort of a choice to make with these algorithms, which is like, do we just add that percentage of stochasticity into our model?
Mm-hmm.
Or do we just predict 100% and not allow you to access that well of surprise, right?
Well, see, for me, an ethical decision would be to add surprise, to add.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
Because it's taking away our ability to discover new types of experience.
Exactly. And this is what I was trying to say with the tension between stability and entropy. That entropy is necessary precisely for an ethical stability.
Like part of us being a thing is that we have to have some sort of consistency, right? YouTube is trying to interest us by showing us novelty when we want new things that just aren't so new. Like we have very narrow parameters for what sort of novelty we're up for. And they have to try and target in on that thing. And that's sort of the tension there, which in some ways is like that criticality that you discuss, right?
Yes.
It's just that for them, it's lucrative to be on the more stable and less critical side. Because if it is critical, then you might just go, no, screw this. I'm not watching this anymore. I'm leaving this platform because it's violated some nonlinear aspect of your preference.
Yeah, I think with YouTube, I feel like it's a tricky conversation. Maybe Scott, you sound like you're very informed, so maybe you know better the algorithms they're using. But the feeling I have is that, have you seen the Social Dilemma documentary?
I watched bits of it. It sort of really annoyed me the way it was filmed, so I stopped.
Okay. Yeah, I also like there was a part of the YouTube algorithm that was like dramatized. And I really think like it's not clear, like they are using mostly like they have such huge amounts of data that there is not so many algorithms that can deal with that kind of prediction. And the way neural networks work, I'm not sure that they are just like they are just maximizing a goal, right? An objective function. So it's not about having the right amount of novelty for you in general, but rather about how to maintain your engagement. So your activity in its moment influences the suggestions that you get, which is one of the few points I found interesting in the Social Dilemma, that they are like, oh, the guy, like they are like these people that are like the algorithm deciding what to show you, and they're like, oh, he's about to disengage, then maybe we should show this. So I think it's a bit more, at least I see it as, a bit more complex in the things they show you. I would say ethically the entropy, the introducing entropy, I don't know that it would be, for me, morally different, because if you still have the same objective function and you're just like many, like it's a exploration-exploitation trade-off, right? And making it more optimal if you still have the same objective function, which is engagement, then I think it's the same thing. The solution would be to change the actual objective function, no? And to have other measures of what you want people to get from YouTube.
Yeah, it's almost to inflate the objective function, right? Because if you try and reduce everything down to one particular metric, then I think you'll exhaust the value behind that metric, right? Like we've all seen how while outrage is a constant part of our political environment now, the number of outrageous things has increased, and our reaction to that outrage is sort of, it's maybe a slowly increasing thing, but at some point, like I don't really feel outraged about anything anymore after being in the US. Like there's just nothing that can really happen. If Trump walked out and like shot someone, I'd be like, oh, that's outrageous, I guess. What next? There's no room for it. So that sensation it still seems to be reinforcing, but it's not. It's been mined out. It's exhausted. And if they have one objective function, it'll just move across various different supporting structures, and then those will be exhausted.
Yeah, I think that's the point of this criticality or flattening or awareness, that it's not just about one element, focusing just on one or replacing one metric with another. It's more about like enriching the way we see the entire relationality there.
I think the point of individualism you make is really important, because it seems to be a constant problem that would also be something that would be interesting to see if TTT could address, is that all of the answers, like you're saying now, are sort of individualistic, right? That climate change, we should recycle. It's not about large polluters as much as like we should do something. We should all vote. We should all do these individual acts in which our actual individual act is statistically meaningless to a large extent, right? Like so. But then social media companies are perhaps the worst for this, because they are the thing, right? Or they're the situation in which we are things.
Mm.
So they're saying, you should act individually in response to this, that they have a massive amount of technology that's sort of aimed at finding whatever niche they can in the way that we value or cognize the world, to exploit that to grasp our attention. And if they have the right approach, it's going to be very hard for individuals to overcome that.
Mm.
And it's the same, like they have the same problem with Occupy, is that like Occupy Wall Street, when it started, was sort of a fundamentally individualistic process, right? Everyone got together in those large circles and they became human microphones. There was no central leadership. There was no binding thing beyond the fact that they were all individuals. And if they all got together and were positive to each other, solutions would emerge. So there is no modern new opposition to individualism. There's sort of old-fashioned fascism and stuff on one side, and there's also more classic leftward thinking on the left side. But there's no other form of overcoming individualism that I'm aware of.
There are like post-colonialism focuses a lot on this, on post-individualism, so decentralizing, because individualism is a centralized system. It leads to it endows a central institution with power to protect your personal interests. That's what like modern political systems are based on. And like I was saying, post-colonialism, for example, tries to promote decentralized systems in which individuals are primarily understood on a communal basis, so not as personal interests. But
What do you guys think about non-dualism? Have you heard about it, like as in the Buddhist Vedic context?
yeah, so there is also this trend of like Asian philosophy in which, so all I know is mostly like Zen Buddhism and Japanese philosophy that attempts to bring an alternative to European contemporary or modern philosophy. But they all rely, the ones I know, they mostly rely on Heidegger and phenomenology, and they argue that the main ontological framework is nothingness, and nothingness understood as absence of all kind of difference between things. But I also think this is not an adequate account because it has the same weakness as Heidegger had, like the the danger of endowing this mysterious nothingness with like political mystical powers, which so aestheticizing and turning this idea into a romantic fascist idea of we are the ones that are having access to the nothingness, to the original primordial state of being. And I think there's interesting points there and really motivating thoughts, but I also, yeah, I see some weaknesses that I don't fully agree with.
Interesting. I thought Zen was sort of a reaction to that idea. That it's supposed to be, well, the way I saw it was more that it was sort of a constant tension between process and surprise. And that you shouldn't, within that theory, not ever feel like you reached the point you described.
Okay.
Like that's the idea. If you like there's a Zen story where basically a guy burns this old statue of the Buddha,
Mm-hmm.
and that's considered a Zen act because it's exactly doing, it's violating exactly what you're saying. In the same way, if you're meditating and they hit you with a stick, it's to sort of inject surprise or to create a moment of sudden entropy within the whatever structure you're building, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the idea of Zen is that sudden ideal realization of surprise, I think.
I think that Varela was directly connecting Zen Buddhism with the extended mind theory. If you're interested in that, Jaime, in the his most famous book, which I don't remember the title, maybe Scott knows it.
The embodied mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the embodied mind. Yeah. I was also looking at the Wikipedia page now, and I think that what Razvan was calling nothingness is maybe referred here as emptiness, maybe.
Yeah, sorry, I read was in German, so it's probably emptiness.
I think sort of fundamentally we were talking about surprise earlier, and there's some aspect that's fundamental across all the forms of meditation, which is changing one's posture towards surprise. And that's that nature of attachment and aversion. So like using neuroscience as a metaphor, we sort of have dopamine responses to things that are appetitive, things that we like. And then when those things are absent, we get a decrease in dopamine. And that's sort of the fundamental part of a reinforcement learning model. It's the instructive signal that drives us to learn things about the world. But if you wanted to take that as a metaphor in Buddhism, basically what Buddhism would say is that's not good because you're building a series of attachments to things and aversions to their absence.
Yeah, no, me either.
I'm curious about this emptiness. So as far as I know, an incompatibility with TTT would be, but I might be mistaken, that this emptiness is like all encompassing. And so there is no distinctness there between anything. And in TTT, it's more about this interaction between autonomous parts. Or like, so it's not that I as a person, when thinking about myself as an infinite thing, it's not that I integrate myself in this differenceless emptiness. It's just the description of myself without the situational restrictness. And I think in Buddhism, it goes more to like a monism kind of thing, in which we are all just this emptiness, but I don't know, instantiated as a person, as an I, as, and TTT is not a monism. It's more a pluralistic ontology of infinite things coming together, or So it's more like this
I think
example
that
of the wasp and the orchid. They're not reducible to any other thing, nor to each other, but they are still interconnected. And it's essential to them, that interconnectedness.
Within this framework, like we had this idea of complete entropy and complete and zero entropy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of in between the two is criticality. I think this idea of emptiness, at least how it's explained as a stage of experience, is sort of the optimal critical state in between them, in that there's nothing really happening there, but anything that does matters is deeply perceivable. So if you have 100% entropy and then some relation occurs, you're unlikely to notice because it's all very chaotic. And if something is very, very structured, there's no possibility of a new relation. So like at least in the psychological sense of the emptiness, it's creating the conditions for the best way of experiencing a new relation.
Okay.
It's like flattening everything down so that anything new that occurs has some sort of perceptual gain to it,
Mm-hmm.
where you notice it more because it's less cluttered with your predictive models.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So that I see as compatible. I'm just not sure about like the ontological status that the emptiness has, and the I, and subjectivity, and so on and so forth, within philosophical reappropriations of Buddhism.